Someone get that old man a bus pass and be done with it, a voice grumbled from the back of the DMV line. The elderly gentleman struggled to balance his cane in one hand while his trembling fingers clutched his worn wallet in the other. Not a single person stepped forward to assist him. No one even bothered to look up until his wallet slipped from his grasp and a weathered photograph tumbled out onto the floor. The black and white image showed four Marines, one carrying another through billowing smoke and debris. In that moment, the entire room fell into a profound silence as someone recognized both the photograph and the man who had spent decades avoiding recognition but was finally being seen. Welcome to Heartfelt Chronicles, where we share stories of unexpected compassion and quiet heroism. Let's discover what truly transpired that day. The morning in Des Moines brought an unusual chill. Leaden clouds hung heavily over the city, and outside the downtown DMV, the queue already stretched halfway around the building before 8 a.m. Inside, the waiting area was packed with people in thick coats, their glasses fogged, all listening for their numbers over the crackling loudspeaker. People shifted restlessly, clutching their documents and identification cards. Nobody engaged in conversation. Patience was in short supply today. At window 6 stood an elderly man, his cane resting gently against the counter. He wore a faded olive-green military jacket with fraying threads at the cuffs. A navy blue knit cap covered his thinning white hair. His gray mask, slightly loose at the edges, concealed his mouth but not the deep lines etched across his face by time. His name was George Langley, 80 years old, former United States Marine. He walked with a noticeable limp in his left leg, slightly bowed with a stiffness in the knee, an old wound from Vietnam. But you'd never hear him mention it. He never discussed Hugh City, not even with his neighbors. Today he had come to renew his driver's license. He still drove himself to the pharmacy weekly and occasionally made early morning visits to the cemetery. Independence was precious to him. As he leaned toward the counter, the young woman behind the glass repeated her request, raising her voice slightly. "Sir, I need your current license and 2 forms of identification. Do you have them ready?" George nodded slowly, reaching into his coat pocket with one hand while gripping the counter's edge with the other for stability. His fingers fumbled inside the lining. Behind him, someone shifted impatiently. A cough, followed by a muttered sigh. George pulled out a thin leather wallet, brown, creased, barely held together at the corners. He opened it carefully, but his hands shook. Not from nervousness, but from the relentless march of time. Everything took longer than it once had. A man in his 30s, standing 3 people back, exhaled sharply and rolled his eyes. "This is ridiculous," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just mail him a bus pass and move on." A few people chuckled behind their masks. George didn't react or turn around. He simply looked down, thumbing through the cards inside his wallet, searching for the correct identification. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled out a folded paper tucked deep in the pocket. Then something came loose. It drifted from the wallet, light as a feather, and floated to the ground between his boots. A photograph, black and white, worn by years. The woman behind the counter noticed it first. Her voice softened, puzzled. "Sir, you dropped something." George blinked. He looked down and saw the picture face up on the tile floor. He bent slowly, one hand on the counter, and reached down with effort, but someone else stepped forward. From across the room, a man wearing a staff badge and black fleece had started walking over. He'd been passing by when the raised voices caught his attention. The photo lay exposed under the harsh DMV lighting, as out of place as an ancient artifact on a linoleum floor. The man knelt down and picked it up. He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. It was an image captured decades ago. 4 young Marines standing shoulder to shoulder before a bombed-out building. Hugh City, 1968, the Tet Offensive. George appeared in the photo, thinner, dark-haired, but with the same serious eyes. One of the others was a man from Iowa, a young private, barely 19 at the time. He had a crooked smile and his helmet sat tilted back on his head. The staff member's expression gradually changed. His name was David Thompson, and the young man grinning beside George in that photograph was his father. David blinked, uncertain if what he was seeing could possibly be real. He had that same photo at home, framed in wood, displayed on his hallway shelf near his family service medals, but his copy had a slight darkening in one corner. His dad had spilled coffee on it years ago. This one remained untouched, still crisp along the edges. He looked up at the elderly man before him, then back at the photo. "Sir," he said quietly, lowering his voice, "are you George Langley?" The room didn't notice initially. Too many people were focused on their phones, grumbling under their breath, tapping their feet impatiently. But something in the atmosphere shifted. George hesitated, unsure how to respond, then gave a small nod. David's hands trembled. "My father," he said, "James Thompson. He served with you and Hugh, didn't he?" George's eyes flickered with recognition. "Jimmy?" His voice was raspy. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in years. The memory struck him harder than anticipated. A rooftop, a sniper's line of sight, 3 wounded men, and one desperate sprint with Jimmy draped over his shoulder through a storm of glass and smoke. "He always said," David continued, his voice tight with emotion, "that someone carried him out. Said he never saw your face clearly, just remembered the voice. You were 28 and you never even told him your last name." George remained silent. He was still looking at the photograph. A ghost of a smile passed through his eyes. From the back of the line, the impatient man tried to interject again. But this time, someone shushed him. A quiet ripple spread through the waiting room. People began to realize something significant was unfolding. David turned toward the crowd, not with anger, but with something deeper. Reverence. He handed the photo back to George, still kneeling, then stood slowly. David Thompson hadn't planned to stop at window 6. He was just walking past, clipboard in hand, checking on staffing for the afternoon shift. Mondays were always chaotic, but today felt worse. The winter cold, the backlog of appointments, and too many people who clearly didn't want to be there. He'd caught the raised voices before he saw their source. The impatient man muttering about a bus pass, the DMV clerk stalling awkwardly, unsure how to handle the tension. And then he saw it, a piece of history lying face up on the floor, something delicate and profound right in the midst of all that noise. David stepped forward instinctively. He bent down to retrieve it, brushing the corner gently as he lifted it from the tile. It was a photograph, faded but clear. 4 men in uniform standing shoulder to shoulder before a crumbling wall. Likely a bombed-out school or command post. No smiles, just young, serious faces. Sunlight casting sharp shadows across dust-covered helmets. And one of those faces, David stopped breathing momentarily. The second man from the right, hands clasped behind his back, chin slightly tilted, was his father, James Thompson. David had grown up with that face in every room of their house. A framed copy of this very photo hung in his family's hallway, right above the folded flag, and beneath the medals his dad never liked to discuss. He stared at the man beside him in the picture. Shorter than the others, square-jawed, olive skin darkened by the sun, holding a rifle low across his chest. The name had never been written on the back, but his father always said, "That's the man who saved me." I never knew his full name. Just George. David's throat tightened. He looked up. The man standing at the counter now had deeper lines in his face, and his back curved forward with age. But the eyes remained the same, calm, sharp, observing the room without needing to speak. David held the photo in both hands and took a slow step forward. "Sir," he said, his voice low, almost uncertain it would emerge correctly. "Are you George Langley?" The old man's eyebrows rose slightly. David felt a ripple move through the room. "Did you fight in Hugh City in 1968? The moment stretched thin. Even the clerk behind the glass froze, one hand still hovering above the keyboard. George blinked, paused, then gave a small nod. David turned the photo slightly, showing it to him. "You carried my father out. You were the one. He told me someone ran across open ground and dragged him back after the ambush." George didn't answer immediately, but his lips parted slowly. His voice emerged gravelly and soft. Jimmy from Council Bluffs. He was hit near the church. I remember. David stared. He hadn't heard his father's hometown mentioned by a stranger in decades. The way George said it, flat and matter-of-fact, like he was describing something that had happened just last week. The impatient man from earlier stepped back, now looking down at the floor. Even the teenagers in line stopped scrolling on their phones. The silence in the DMV was eerie, but not uncomfortable. It was reverent. David turned slightly to face the waiting room. His voice remained quiet, but it carried throughout the space. This man, he said, holding the photo gently in one hand, saved my father's life in Vietnam. No one spoke. The buzz of fluorescent lights hummed above them. Outside, snowflakes had begun falling again. He turned back to George. I've had this picture hanging in my house since I was 8. My dad never forgot that day. He said there was smoke everywhere, and he thought he was dead until someone grabbed him and didn't let go. George shook his head slowly. I didn't do it for thanks, he said. I just didn't want to leave anyone behind. David's eyes welled up. He couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the absurd contrast, this moment here in a place known for frustration and bureaucracy. Maybe it was the quiet steadiness of George's voice, or the photo, now weathered by time, somehow surviving long enough to make it back to someone who needed to see it. He held the photo against his chest gently, then looked up at the clerk. Please pause his appointment. The clerk nodded, speechless. David looked around the room. Everyone, just give us a moment. No one objected. David led George away from the counter slowly, not out of disrespect, but because something about it felt too significant for administrative process. They moved to the edge of the waiting area near the frosted windows. People turned their chairs to watch, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. David offered George a seat. The older man declined. Of course he did. Instead, he leaned slightly on his cane, standing tall in the only way he knew how. David took a deep breath. My dad passed 3 years ago, he said, but he talked about you until the very end. Said he never got to thank the man who saved him. George looked down at the photo again. You tell him, he said gently. He made it count. David smiled even as his eyes watered. He took out his phone and scrolled quickly through the gallery, found a photo, and held it next to the one George had dropped. The same moment, the same faces, just 2 lives separated by 5 decades. He stepped back toward the middle of the room. I want everyone here to understand something, he said. There's a lot of paperwork in this building, a lot of procedures, but none of that matters if we forget why we're standing here in the first place. He turned to George. You waited in line without complaint. You were mistreated, spoken over, ignored, but you didn't raise your voice. You didn't flash credentials. You didn't ask for anything. He paused. You already gave. George didn't answer. He didn't need to. The room stayed silent, not out of shock, but out of a kind of shared understanding, a slow, steady kind of honor that passed from person to person. David turned to the clerk. Let's get Mr. Langley processed right now. No more waiting. He reached for the intercom, and for the first time that day, the entire DMV fell still. David Thompson stood motionless for a moment, the weight of what he was about to do settling on his shoulders. The room wasn't noisy anymore. No tapping shoes, no irritated sighs, no rustling papers. Just quiet, a strange, gentle hush in a place never designed for reverence. He turned toward the clerk behind the desk, who was still holding George Langley's paperwork as if it were made of glass. Stop, David said, his voice firm but calm. No more processing for now. The clerk blinked, then nodded. David walked to the center of the room, footsteps soft but deliberate against the tile. He reached for the old PA microphone mounted by the wall. A dusty intercom few people even remembered still worked. With a low buzz, he pressed the button. I need to say something. His voice echoed gently through the speakers overhead. Please, everyone, just a moment. A few people looked up from their phones. Some had already put them away. Others sat in silence, hands folded, waiting. David glanced around the room, his eyes resting on George, who stood just as quietly as he had 20 minutes ago, his left leg leaning into the cane as it always had. David cleared his throat. The man you see here today, this quiet man who stood in line like everyone else, once carried my father, bleeding and unconscious, through enemy fire in Hughes City, 1968. He looked down at the photo in his hand, still warm from his grip. My father wouldn't have survived that day, and I wouldn't be standing here now if not for George Langley. No one moved, no one interrupted. David took a breath. So if he takes his time today, I think we all owe him that much. Silence, then a rustle from the back row. A young mother stood up, her hand resting on her son's shoulder. She gave a single nod, respectful, then sat back down. A teenager in a hoodie dropped his eyes to the floor, the same one who'd been muttering earlier. He didn't say a word. Then another sound, a chair being scooted gently to the side. One of the clerks stepped out from behind the glass wall carrying a gray DMV chair with metal legs. Not fancy, not important looking, but it was clean and it meant something. David met him halfway and helped carry it over. He placed it down right in front of the main service window, then turned to George. Please, Mr. Langley, let me help. George looked at the chair, then at David, then the rest of the room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hand tightened slightly on the cane, and after a pause, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. David offered an arm for support. George didn't take it, but he nodded, appreciative, still proud, still steady. When he finally sat down, a breath seemed to pass through the room, a collective exhale. David turned to the clerk again. Let's finish this man's renewal. The young woman behind the desk, perhaps 25 or 30, had tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. She nodded quickly, typing without a word. For the next 5 minutes, no one made a sound. George answered every question clearly when asked. His voice never wavered. His hands still trembled slightly, but he held his ID in place, looked straight into the camera, and didn't flinch when the flash went off. When the temporary paper license printed, David reached for it, then paused. He turned to George. Do you still drive often, sir? George nodded once. Only for the morning paper and to take my neighbor's dog to the vet sometimes. David smiled. He handed him the form. Then keep driving, Mr. Langley. George folded the paper carefully, then stood without help and adjusted his coat. From the back, an older man, maybe in his 60s, raised his hand awkwardly. I served too, he said. Nam, 71. I just wanted to say thank you. George nodded again. Then another voice spoke up. My uncle was in Hugh. He never made it back. I think he would have liked knowing this happened here. One by one, little waves of voices, no shouting, no declarations, just quiet acknowledgments, like the kind of salute you do with your heart instead of your hand. As George walked slowly toward the exit, David followed beside him. The line of people, once a crowd of strangers, now resembled something closer to a silent procession. No one tried to go next. No one rushed forward. A young man near the door opened it quietly, held it open with both hands. As George stepped out into the cold, the snow had begun to fall again. Gentle, not sharp or angry, just soft enough to rest on his beanie without melting too quickly. David stepped out behind him. Sir, he said just above a whisper, what made you keep the photo all these years? George looked down at his gloved hand, where the folded image rested now, half tucked into the crease of his coat. He didn't answer immediately. Then, without turning, he spoke. Because the boys in that photo didn't all get to come home, but I did. David nodded slowly. George added, and I figured if one of their kids ever needed to know, I ought to still be able to show them. The wind blew slightly then, nothing harsh, just enough to tug at his coat collar. Then George Langley walked down the ramp, cane tapping gently against the concrete. He didn't look back, and David watched him until he disappeared around the corner, the soft sound of traffic returning as the world slowly exhaled again. The next morning, David Thompson sat at his kitchen table, still wearing the same jacket he'd worn at the DMV. His laptop sat open in front of him, and next to it, carefully laid flat, was the black and white photo. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. So before sunrise, with a mug of coffee growing cold, he wrote something. A post, just a few paragraphs, no hashtags, no emojis. He titled it, "He Waited His Whole Life to Be Seen." Then he uploaded the photo, the original George had dropped, and beside it a second photo he'd taken from home. Same four men, same dust-covered boots, same exhausted smiles, half in uniform, half in dirt, and in the middle, the young man holding another man on his shoulder. That was George. David wrote, "Yesterday I met someone at the DMV. He wasn't loud. He didn't demand anything. He waited in line like everyone else, even though he could barely stand. My name is David Thompson, and 52 years ago, this man carried my father out of a war zone in Hughes City. Without him, my dad wouldn't have survived. Without him, I wouldn't be here at all. His name is George Langley, and he deserves to be seen." He hit post. Then he went to bed, not expecting much. By morning, there were 300 shares. By lunch, local stations were calling. And by dinner, George Langley's name was trending across Iowa. The following week, two unexpected things happened. First, a handwritten letter arrived at George's door. Not typed, not emailed, but real, folded and creased by a man with careful hands. It was signed by Major General Arthur McMillan, retired, and it read, "Dear Mr. Langley, I don't know if you remember me. I was the terrified 19-year-old who froze during the ambush on Loy Street. I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. But you did. You didn't just carry me. You shielded me. And because of that, I got to grow old. I got to marry. I got to raise daughters. I got to serve 3 more tours. I owe you everything. I never said it then, but I'm saying it now. Thank you, Corporal Langley." George held the letter like it was glass. Then he placed it next to the photo, right under the small frame on his mantle where both had always belonged. He didn't like the attention. Never had. So when the reporters came, he politely declined. When someone offered to repaint his porch, he thanked them, but said the old wood still held up just fine. But something had changed. Now when he walked down to the corner store, people nodded. When he paused at crosswalks, drivers waved him through. When he sat on the bench outside the library where he liked to read the paper, strangers would sometimes sit beside him just to say hello. One man came up and said, "You don't know me, but my uncle served with someone named Langley. You wouldn't happen to—" George smiled, then shook his head. "Probably not me," he said softly, but he smiled anyway. 2 weeks later, a ceremony was held at the Des Moines Community Library. It wasn't flashy, no red carpet, just a few folding chairs, a podium, and a bronze plaque. David stood in front of a small crowd, clergy, teachers, veterans, parents holding toddlers, and cleared his throat. He gestured to the newly renovated corner of the library where the light from the window hit just right. "This space," he said, "will now be called the Langley Reading Room." He looked to the side. George sat in the front row, wearing a navy sport coat over his old olive green shirt, still with his wooden cane, still with that quiet posture. David continued, "For those who don't know, George Langley never asked to be honored. He never asked for applause. But decades ago, in a narrow street in Hughes City, he made sure 3 young soldiers came home. And yesterday, I finally got to tell him, one of those soldiers was my dad." A pause. Somewhere in the back, someone sniffled. David placed a hand on the plaque. "Langley Reading Room for the Quiet Heroes." Then he stepped down, and the first person to speak after that was an elderly woman. She didn't give a speech. She just walked up, placed a single white carnation on the podium, and whispered, "He reminds me of my brother," and that was enough. That night, George sat at his kitchen table. He didn't have a laptop or a smartphone. He didn't even know what trending meant. But he had a stack of letters now, and a folded copy of that newspaper article tucked neatly into the Bible he hadn't opened in years. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, aged envelope. Inside was the photo, the same one from Hugh, still slightly curled from time. He turned it over and with a ballpoint pen wrote, "Seen, finally." Then he placed it back. Sometimes people still ask David why he made such a big deal over something small. He always answers the same way. Some heroes never ask for anything, but they deserve to be seen, even if it takes 52 years. And in Des Moines, Iowa, in a small corner of a library where sunlight pools at 10:15 every morning, there's a plaque that reminds anyone who reads, "Quiet doesn't mean forgotten. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places." Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget this story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more powerful stories of everyday heroes whose quiet acts of courage change lives forever.